If Donald Trump returns to the Oval Office, American foreign policy will face a seismic shift, unquestionably. Some say he'll abandon Ukraine and turn away from NATO completely. Others worry about escalation between the US, with Russia and China particularly. But others claim there will be no wars, no World War III, and that great power competition and global tensions more broadly will calm down under Trump. So today in this video, we deep dive into a Trump foreign policy 2.0, what it could mean for the US and the global stage.
This is the Global Gambit.
How are you going? So today we're exploring the possibilities and potential surprises of a second Trump presidency, specifically in the context of foreign policy. Now, I actually did, if you're new to the channel, a arguably part 1 video on a Kamala Harris foreign policy, which some might argue is not going to be too much different from Biden's existing one, but I actually beg to differ a little bit and broke that down in specifically 3 main areas, which you can find on your screen now and click above or find in the description. And I recommend that you consider subscribing whilst you're at it. I also welcome different opinions, so if you disagree with some of the points made in this video, then do drop a comment, but let's keep it civil. So let's get into the situation with a potential Trump 2.0 presidency and foreign policy. So he would return in a very different status of quos. 2 major regional wars, a US border crisis, and the unprecedented levels of tensions between the West more broadly and what some people call the autocratic axis involving China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and so on. So how might Trump respond to these challenges? And what exactly would that mean for America's role on the global stage, but also closer to home and in the US? Because many Americans want greater emphasis on domestic issues like migration, which we will come to later on in the video. But let's start with a little bit of context so that it helps us understand exactly how Trump's potential foreign policy could evolve. Because it's important to revisit some of those shifts in that time since he was in office 4 years ago. During that term, Trump took a big emphasis and hard stance on allies, quote, paying their fair share, specifically criticizing NATO most of all for many European members' nations' overdependence on American defense. But he also ramped up a lot of economic pressure with China, the trade wars, which the Biden administration subsequently refined through more specific industry-targeted policies. Well, they began, and that's where the famous term decoupling began and has now become omnipresent in lots of international relations, geopolitical, economic, policy, and just wonk, nerdy circles. But under the Biden administration, the international tensions did undeniably intensify. One of the biggest points that pro-Trump camp individuals like to make is that there were no major conflicts under Trump. But it's not that simple. And there were a lot of claims that Trump has made around areas of extreme terrorism and attacks that did increase and were worse under the Trump administration. Just they didn't have as much far-reaching implications as some of the conflicts we see at the moment. Now, Biden's foreign policies did focus more on upholding democratic, quote, ideals, sort of the autocratic versus democratic fight. But some critics have argued that this vision is not really sustainable nor pragmatic for American foreign policy, given, for some reasons, America's stretched resources, stagnant defense budget, but also just the pragmatic reality of the globe, the hard reality that we're in, and that, unfortunately, you have to perhaps engage in relationships and actions you might not otherwise want to do from a idealistic perspective. Some Republican voices, such as Trump advisors, former Trump advisors, are calling for a more pragmatic approach that prioritizes, interestingly, I find, military investment and regional responsibility among allies. So this difference is key, namely because it's almost like a prioritization. Countries that can get higher up on the list of priority under the new potential Trump administration would therefore benefit from US attention and potential recipient of greater support, whatever that might look like. So it's almost like a attractivity contest, right? An attraction contest. Who can attract the Trump administration most so that they can get what they need? Now let's break down into a few specific areas in what could be Trump's main foreign policy priorities. Firstly, and unsurprisingly, Ukraine, NATO, and Europe. Now, Trump has vowed to end the Ukrainian conflict within, quote, 24 hours, but has also warned of an arms increase if Putin weren't to comply. So it's not all completely one-sided. In his first term, Trump has pressured NATO countries to boost their defense spending, and that is now coming to fruition. Over 20 nations in NATO have met or actually succeeded the 2% GDP defense spending target, something Trump could leverage even further. And with American exports now making up over 40% of global arms exports, a second Trump administration would likely continue pushing Europe to take more responsibility, even as it benefits US defense contractors. For example, at the same time, Trump might feel less inclined to withdraw troops or support more broadly, given the increased European spending. If the Europeans show that they are willing to pick up more of the slack, then Trump might be willing to continue to support European collective security. This is where Trump's unpredictability, though, could play out, whilst Kamala Harris is arguably a little bit more predictable, at least primarily in the European transatlantic area. It's not as clear about Trump. Will he increase support to prevent European instability, or will he still prioritize pulling US forces back to such an extent that it might cost US economic strategic interests? These are not necessarily opinions, they're just important questions to consider. Second, and obviously arguably the most overarching important challenge for any administration, let alone Trump, is China. It represents perhaps the biggest wild card. Trump's stance on China has been tough in his first term, with tariffs and an aggressive push for this decoupling. Since then, China's influence, though, has only grown. It's got a larger navy, it's got deeper partnerships, especially with Russia, but also with Iran, and it's been growing its influence across other regions, including the island Pacific nations, such as the defense pact with the Solomon Islands in 2022, or across sub-Saharan Africa with the BRI and other initiatives, and then not to forget its own relationship with Taiwan. Trump's approach could range from continuing trade pressure to pursuing a broader containment strategy alongside European and Asian allies, although that seems a little bit at odds with his desire for America first and arguably isolationist kind of policies. If Trump were to impose more tariffs, of which seems likely, given that he wants to double some of the tariffs that the Trump-Biden administration have already imposed, then that would potentially get even worse because he could revoke what's known as China's most favored nation status. With 80% of Americans viewing China unfavorably, Trump may take a calculated approach to thinking that overall economic fallout with China is worth it if it means he gets more domestic support at home. Thirdly is the Middle East, and more specifically, the Islamic Republic of Iran. With Iran's influence expanding and threats mounting, Trump might go for a major military buildup. There are some people within his camp who are very keen to take it to Iran, to paraphrase one such individual. Now, one even said that his campaign might even be the largest since the Vietnamese War era. His approach to Iran could also be bolstered with coalitions like Saudi Arabia and expanded US energy exports to weaken the Iranian and Russian relative influence across Europe. Europe, for example, who would still be critical to support US if it did decide to build up some massive military presence in the region. Although I find that rather, again, difficult to believe, considering that it goes against what Trump has been saying for much of his campaigning. Domestically, the energy sector would be a very big factor here because Trump's previous energy policies position the US as a net exporter, and increased production would give him leverage over China and Europe alike. Indeed, at the time of recording, the US is the largest energy producer in the world. Fourth, perhaps a little bit of a abstract example, but I still think worth covering, is immigration and the US-Mexican border. Now, Trump has made it very clear that immigration and his desire to deport illegal immigrants is a priority. Since he left office, it's no denying border encounters have skyrocketed, with some suggestions that illegal crossings have hit 10 million. Well, Trump's return would mean a drastic shift in these federal sources, with some people suggesting that you could see a redeployment of troops from overseas to just the southern border to secure it and ensure the blocking of things like fentanyl trafficking. But this does raise another tough question. Would a broader administration, let alone just Trump, be cool with trading off influence in other regions, which might not seem like a major importance to American interests immediately, but over time potentially have backlashes at the expense of ensuring America's near board is 100% under control. The GOP's platform promises advanced tech and naval support on the border, for example, but it would still mean tough trade-offs and considerations. Lastly, and heavily connected to the immigration, is obviously economics and trade policy. The economic landscape has shifted in Trump's favor a lot in this regard. The US now makes up about 26% of global GDP if you're measuring in nominal terms, giving Trump leverage for the, quote, fair trade deals he's often promised. Talks with Japan and the UK could resume, for example, and recent EU sanctions on Chinese products indicate that Trump might find willing partners in a broader trade war against China. So could you see the collective desire to offset the rise of China, quote unquote, coming through more powerfully than Trump's grievances and reservations over European dependency or need for US security? Were European nations be willing to be more hawkish towards China, which they've been not as willing to do, think de-risking versus decoupling, which is a less extreme version, then that could mean actually a greater unity between Western allies, which ironically is not what some might expect. But still, tensions would be high. Trump's rhetoric is very polarizing for many European nations, and it could alienate some of the allies, especially if he focuses primarily on American interests, even at the expense of allies or adversaries, which he has indicated he might be willing to do. And then the last area, which I think brings in all these elements together, particularly the last one, is global alliances and this sort of military expansion or internalization. For a second term, Trump has hinted at the largest US military buildup in nearly half a century. Again, that seems to go in the face of what we've heard at other times during his various rallies. But given the threats from China, Iran, and an emboldened Russia, at least from the perspective of the US, Trump's policy could mean prioritizing American military primacy on the world stage. This would resonate with a lot of Republican, what are known as primacists, who see a need for the US to continue that military supremacy globally. But that goes in the face of many Republicans who prefer being more restrained or completely just focused on America issues. And what some people might just see as primacists are more just neocons who are hawkish about engaging and being lost in forever war, something that Trump has promised that would not happen again. On the other side, you've got the restrainers and prioritizers. These are terms that categorize different groups, not just the MAGA community, but also the Republican base more broadly. And prioritizers are particularly interesting because they are more niche. They're more specifically targeted towards Asia, emphasizing that the US needs to prioritize the South Pacific or the Indo-Pacific more broadly to deal with the growing challenges faced by China and its relationship to its autocratic axes that it can help sort of boost. And so some people are saying maybe not be completely internalized on American issues, but just be more designated in your priorities. And interestingly, I think this comes at a time where we're seeing a shift in overall how foreign policy works. If you're new to the channel, I have emphasized in the past the idea of transactionality. We see this developing quite a lot with countries like India or more broadly just non-Western nations, countries that are non-aligned. They don't necessarily support too much the countries that are more aggressively opposed to US hegemon, but also that aren't necessarily 100% with the West. And you could see Trump trying to leverage some of this more transactionality in his foreign policy as a way to get simply more of what he wants. But, as we can see, a second Trump administration would bring a broad array, a plethora of challenges, from these unpredictable escalations to potential negotiations. Trump's policies would mark a return to reform policy focused on hard power and self-reliance. His stance on allies and adversaries, be that in Europe or Asia, could redefine America's role in the world for a significant time. And with the mounting conflicts, it's very difficult to see exactly what direction he wants to take, given that what he says at one time might actually end up planning out very differently, as we did see in his first time in other ways as well. But that's it from me. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video and this breakdowns, if you found this breakdown insightful, then do consider subscribing. It means a lot. And I also welcome, as I said at the beginning, different opinions, different comments from you. And if you have any guest recommendations, as we do cover a lot of different perspectives on the channel, then do drop a comment with those as well. But thanks a lot. What do you think about a 2.0 foreign policy under Trump? Love to hear your thoughts. Till next time. Take care.